because each institution, the Canadian military, the German military, EU Commission, each institution has its dysfunctions. But the more aware an institution is of its own dysfunctions, the more it can work to balance them. And there was an extent to which the Russian military drank its own Kool-Aid. And I think that then hampered our willingness to say, actually, this isn't an achievable goal. Because the debate before 24 February was, this is going to be an onslaught. All the Ukrainians can do is an insurgency. Ukraine will not survive. This is not a manageable problem.
Welcome to another episode of the Expert Series. In this installment, the CDA Institute spoke with Alexander Clarkson, lecturer in German and European and International Studies at King's College London. Our conversation focused on EU-Russian relations, particularly within the context of the ongoing war in Ukraine. Clarkson touched upon Putin's strategic calculations going into the war, the Russian elite's perception of Ukraine, and how this influenced Putin's calculus to invade, how the war and sanctions are affecting Putin's decision-making and the Kremlin's risk tolerance, as well as how the EU should approach its post-war relationship with Russia. Alex, it's great to meet you. Thanks for joining me today for the CDA Institute Expert Series. To start off our conversation, I'm wondering if you can get into what calculations you think Putin made regarding Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How effective do you think the global response and sanctions regime has been? And do you think Putin expected such a response from the international community?
I think all these three questions connect to a problem that we have dealing with Russia and have had dealing with Russia, or particularly Russian elites. And of course, we have to distinguish between different groups within the Russian elite or state elite. There's a state elite, business elite, a military elite, particular leadership clique around Russia, the wider Russian population that may share some of these points of view, but it's not necessarily uniform. So this is a complex society we're looking at. So when I make these generalizations, which I'm about to make, I always want to sort of caveat that by saying that this isn't like the Russian society is a universal self. But I think this is not just a Putin problem. This is about a fundamental perception of Ukrainian society that has permeated parts of Russian state culture in particular, permeates certainly the thinking of the Russian military, and through that becomes compressed in a particular point of view that we have in Vladimir Putin. And it comes back to an inability to grasp the implications of Ukrainian statehood, not just in the last 30 years. I would argue, this is a little bit unfashionable now, but there were some great scholars like Roman Shporluk who made this point in the 90s. I would argue that, the foundations of Ukrainian statehood are set partly through this very brief bid for independence after the First World War, but actually substantially with the Soviet Republic, right, within Ukraine SSR. There were people in the Ukraine SSR who were communists, who were loyal Soviets, but also took the idea of Ukrainian statehood seriously. And the biggest mistake you could say Moscow ever made was never to take the idea of Ukrainian partnership seriously, the idea of making Ukrainians equal partners in empire, like the English did with the Scots in the United Kingdom, as one of many, many, many good examples of that kind of phenomenon. So this isn't just a Putin problem. That's point one. This is a problem of a substantial point of the Russian political and state elite not grasping the fact that Ukrainian statehood is serious, has led to institutions that are functional, that doesn't grasp the extent to which Ukrainians are committed to the existence of the state and Ukrainians are willing to defend the state. And everything else that you asked about follows from that, right? So Putin comes in and he's operating a very limited information flow, and he's dealing with a wider elite that doesn't take Ukraine particularly seriously. He's in a particular compressed group of people that don't take Ukraine's existence seriously at all. So he assumes that the invasion is going to be easy. It's going to be a dawdle. You send the troops in, Ukrainians will surrender. Maybe those weirdos in Halichina and Bukovina, in the west, far west, will just do their own thing. Maybe the Poles can take them over. This is often a conceit you find in Russian nationalist literature. So from that follows that if they didn't take the concept of Ukraine statehood seriously, they are then surprised when the West takes the concept of Ukraine statehood seriously. So they obviously did not expect, if they don't take Russian, and they look at Britain, or they look at Germany, or they look at France, and even Poland or Italy, and they look at the United States, say these are all great powers, and they often treat other states around them as a subordinate, which they sometimes do. The EU as a whole has a tendency to absorb states and make conditions upon the absorption of states. Say you as a state have to do X and Y to become part of our system. But in the end, they didn't realize that whatever else you might say about neo-colonial or neo-imperial habits of mind that you have in much of Europe, that the United States also has, eliminating the existence of a state entirely was a step far too far. And that in the end, these states took the existence of Ukraine's sovereignty and statehood seriously enough for that to elicit a massive security and economic response. That Russia, if it had just chipped away at Ukrainian sovereignty, if it just meddled here and there, if it had just treated Ukraine in the way, say, which is also illegitimate, problematic, in the way the United States in the 1970s or 80s treated large parts of Latin America, if they'd done this kind of informal empire, indirect approach, they would never have elicited the same response, right? Because the United States never questions the existence of Mexico or Cuba, anything else. That's the fundamental misunderstanding you have when arguing with Russian interlocutors. Like they say, well, the Americans have done X, Y, and Z. Yeah, but they haven't tried to eliminate the existence of these states, right? So that all of this follows from a difficulty from the Russian side to simply take the existence of Ukraine as a Ukrainianness as a distinct identity, as the foundations for states, how that creates a foundation for strong state institutions already under the USSR, and the willingness of Ukrainians to defend that, and the extent to which that manifestation of the existence of Ukraine state is then taken seriously by others. That all follows from that, and that's not just a Putin problem. That's a problem that we're going to have after Putin as well.
Do you think that the consequences of the war will force Putin to change his calculations at some point? What kind of strategic situation could Russia be facing post-war?
I think there's two wars we have to discuss here. One that had, so when people say the Russians have lost, and there's a lot of these announcements making, and I think you have to take it seriously because the Russians have lost one of these two conflicts that we're examining here. And it's one that's going to have impacts on the way the Russian state operates. So when Putin makes this speech on February 24th at 5 a.m. in the morning, there are a lot of different speculation about what are the ultimate strategic goals. And the big mistake Putin makes with that speech is to set basically regime change or ultimately denazification, the elimination of the Ukrainian state as we know it, and they're fundamental, it would be the elimination of Ukrainian society as we know it, as an end goal. And that the Russians have lost. I think we can make that argument now, that they withdrew from Kiev, they can't take the capital, they can't isolate Western Ukraine from the rest of the country, they can't take Kharkiv, which is the second cradle. There's three cradles of Ukrainian national identity, I think maybe four, Odessa, but it's a complicated cultural studies debate, of Kharkiv, Kiev, Lviv, west, center, east, that's the Ukraine. Right, and if Ukraine holds on to all three, you have the foundations, the basic foundations and structures Ukraine statehood survives. So if it holds on to all three, that strategic goal is impossible, and the Russians have lost that. What we might be observing now is a transition to a second war, which is a war over Ukraine's borders. How big is Ukraine? What is Ukraine's final territorial configuration? So I think in terms of Putin's fate, it's destabilizing for his regime and humiliating for his regime that they cannot eliminate Ukraine. That's going to cause them a lot of trouble, particularly with Russian nationalists. How much trouble it causes them depends on how far there can at least be some limited gains the Russians can make to declare some kind of fig leaf victory. So if the Ukrainians, which I think I'm sort of 50-50 on this, I think the Ukrainians can develop the capacity to punch the Russians out of, say, Kharkiv Oblast or parts of Kherson Oblast, the bits on the other side of the Dnieper, around the west side of the Dnieper, not necessarily the east side of the Dnieper. So the Ukrainians probably have the capacity to punch them out of that. Whether they can then hold the Donbass while doing that and then push the Russians out of the rest of the country, I think that's a much more open question, which opens potential scope for Putin to maybe, if, and this is a big if he begins to realize that he's running out of military resources, because remember, this myth of the Russian steamroller is a myth, right? That Russia doesn't have unlimited resources either. If he then eventually erodes Russia's military capability, peacetime military capabilities to the extent to which they can't hold the rest, then he ends up in serious trouble. And we have to plan for that, because that's a possible outcome. I think probably more likely is the Ukrainians take some territory back, struggle to hold the Donbass. Either Putin gets a face-saving way out if he's in really bad military shape and can sort of declare victory and get out, but in ways that destabilize the structure of the state, or you have some form of limited territorial gain for a while, at least that they at least keep until Putin is gone. Even if then, I think Putin can hold on to power and a tight grip on it, but he's still then faced with all kinds of discontented different parts of Russian society because of economic deprivation, because of business damage, because of being cut off from global information and flows. Those are problems from the business circles and the liberals. But in the regions and among nationalists, among part of the military, like he set the goals so high and he stoked so many expectations. He's also going to face a lot of trouble from the army and officers and nationalists who have guns and are also going to make Russia a less stable place as they challenge state authority. So I'm not going to, I have some I think we have to plan for really bad scenarios potentially. What happens if Russia collapses? I don't think that's likely, but it's less unlikely than it was a few weeks or months ago, right? So we have to plan for that. I don't think that's necessarily the most likely outcome, but what is happening is gradually the state becomes less and less stable. The more this drags on, the more this doesn't just cause devastating effects on Ukraine, the more it also destabilizes Russia itself.
Do you think that the international response has impacted the Kremlin's risk tolerance at all?
the primary factor affecting the Kremlin's risk tolerance is the ability of the Ukrainian state to defend itself, right? And I think that what the Ukrainian state does in the first 2 weeks around Kiev is demonstrate to Russia that it's willing to fight and it's going to cause you damage, cause Moscow damage. It also had to do that to demonstrate to the West, not just that Ukrainians were willing to fight, but they were willing to fight skillfully and professionally, right? So a lot of what we see in the first 2 weeks of this conflict is Ukrainians also going to Russia saying, look, we're professionals, we're skilled, we have command and control, right? If you feed us all these weapons, you can trust us to use them properly and in a disciplined fashion. And so that's a lot of what happens initially. So then you see the Western support and aid kick in, not necessarily immediately, but 2 weeks into the conflict, 2-3 weeks into the conflict. Now, whether this affects Moscow's risk calculus, I think is quite difficult to say, because we have to sort of make assumptions about the institutional rationality of Putin and those around him. And this was difficult to elicit. Does Putin have access to reliable sources of information about what's happening on the ground? Does Putin's own personal interpretive framework, is it such that he has a realistic appreciation of what this information is telling him? Clearly, he was not getting realistic information before he decided to invade, because the invasion was an idiotic decision. So then how far is our support affecting that risk calculus? I think certainly certainly a good sign is the fact that they didn't keep going for Kiev, right? That somehow someone in the Russian military system either said to the general staff or said to Putin directly, we're going to annihilate each other and we're not going to gain very much, and we can't keep going with this. So they were willing to withdraw. They're now refocusing efforts on the Donbass, and they may make some progress there, but this is like watching the Battle of Ypres or Battle of Verdun in the First World War being live tweeted, right? These aren't like massive strategic gains. This is like incremental, slow tactical gains as the Ukrainians withdraw to defensive positions. So in terms of the extent to which we're affecting their strategic calculus, I think we are going to start affecting the strategic calculus of the elite and of the military officer corps, because they do not want to see their resources and troops wasted for nothing if the state can't mobilize or won't mobilize. I think that's already visible that it's affecting the calculations of everyone else in the elite. But whether it has a decisive impact on the calculations of Putin himself, I don't know, and I'm not sure. And that doesn't just raise questions about what Putin's going to do, but it also raises questions about if the perceptions of what's going on diverge between Putin's circle and the rest of the state elite. It also opens up questions of what the state elite is going to do in handling Putin going forward.
What is the ideal end state for the EU when it comes to transforming relations with Russia? How should the EU go about rebuilding its Russia strategy? And what are some of the challenges in doing so?
I think the first thing I think it's important to underline is that what we're seeing here, I'm not somebody who's going to go blame the German government or blame the EU for Russia's decision to invade Ukraine. Russia could have done a lot of other things apart from invade Ukraine, right? But certainly what contributed to the kind of decision-making dynamics in Moscow were a set of fundamental policy failures by the EU. And I think that the EU is going to have to sit down, and whereas the US and Canada can play a supporting role in this because they're geopolitical security actors here, the geoeconomic actor is the EU, right? It's the one that has the day-to-day interactions with Russia. And so the EU is going to have to sit down and sort of reassess its approach to Russia. I think the problem now is as you have in these crises, the pendulum has swung wildly from where it was in 2013 to where it is now. So in 2013, 2012, you had this sort of tendency among EU officials and West European EU member state officials of sort of dismissing East European concerns. I mean, even although we have to think, the Polish only start really getting worried quite late in the game, as well around 2008, 2010. So the Poles tend to say we always saw it. No, what the Poles were saying was actually also much friendlier to Russia, maybe 15 years ago. So, there was also different domestic political dynamic in Ukraine. We need to remember it wasn't as straightforward as it was now in terms of, attitudes to Russia and attitudes towards Ukrainian statehood. But what we need to sort of keep in mind is what are so we need to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff. So there's a lot going on in the last 20, 30 years of relations, but I think there's 2 or 3 lessons that the EU needs to learn. First of all, indulging exceptionalism in a neighboring state usually leads to disaster. And I think that's also about fairness. If the EU is going to go to the British after Brexit and say, we're not going to give you a special deal, we know you're you're a pretty powerful state, but for the cohesion of our own system, our single market has rules, our rule of law system has rules. There's also an internal debate with Poland about that within the EU. Our border system has rules, and you're gonna have to stick to those rules because we set the rules and you don't. there is something profoundly problematic about that if you think about how the EU communicated with Russia for the last 30 years, particularly under German encouragement. So there was always a special relationship, and Russia is different and it's special. No, if the EU wants to say that it sets the rules in Europe, then it sets the rules in Europe to everyone. And I think it's more honest towards Russian elites if they reform and want to re-engage, is to say, look, fine, great that you re-engage, but we're not going to bullshit you anymore about this. These are the rules. These are the conditions. You need to conform to these rule of law, economic regulation, justice reform, all these basic conditions that any state needs to fulfill if it wants access to our single market, to our border system, to our everything else, to access for your citizens. So there needs to be an honest conversation about that. And then the second thing pertains to the integration of Ukraine. Right, the Ukrainians really, really want to get integrated in the EU. They really do, and there's a number of very good reasons, geoeconomic and political reasons, for them to do so. And I think that the EU is going to have to balance. Ukrainians have to be realistic about this. The EU is going to have to balance the need to pressure Ukraine to conform to the systems, the way in which the EU works. But I think Ukraine broadly will do that, with the need to sustain a leverage over Ukrainian society. Because what you also risked doing in the run-up to this war, although it's regained a lot of that territory and goodwill from Ukrainians in its response after the war started, is that in constantly slowing down Ukrainian integration, the EU also lost leverage over Kiev without getting any leverage over Russia. Right, and there's a lesson here in terms of relations with Turkey and Tunisia, the other two key strategic states around the EU, right, and Algeria if it drifts in a certain direction. That the EU needs to always still maintain an open integration pathway and encourage integration. That also means giving stuff when another state does stuff. If the Ukrainians do stuff, then they should get something in return in terms of integration. So I think the second strategic problem is simply in terms of in relation to Ukraine, is the EU needs to be willing to integrate Ukraine. Right, because if it doesn't just have no influence over Russia. The Ukrainians will turn around and say, screw you, we need to defend ourselves, we'll not listen to you, we'll do whatever we want. That's not necessarily good for European security either. Final point, more briefly, is one about European strategic autonomy. We can't expect the Americans to bail us out every time. And it's in Canada's interest as well, by the way, that it has Europeans as a potential second partner that can take care of themselves in their region in the North Atlantic. If America, we're very lucky with the Biden administration, but if America ends up paralyzed, then it's also in Canada's strategic interest that Europeans develop strategic autonomy. So if the Americans are paralyzed, at least the Canadians can go to Brussels and say, whew, well, let's see what we can do, guys, because that's an imminent possibility in the next 2-3 years.
The EU's primary focus right now is understandably the defense of Ukraine. But in the medium term, will the EU have to adopt certain policies to help avert disaster or possibly state fracture within Russia because of the consequences of the war and the sanctions regime?
So I think that this is where I think that the EU, US, Canada, Japan, these are if we speak of the West, throw in South Korea. That's the core West. Korea, Japan, Canada, States, EU, UK, obviously, right? And what these different state systems are not very good at is contingency planning, right? So, maybe 20, 30 years ago, in the 1990s, and I vividly remember, there was a fear of a Russian civil war and a Russian breakup, right? And the focus was on Russian weakness. And out of that came, particularly in Germany, and a German point of view was that, Russia is the special case. We need to help them and get them through trade and close cooperation and dialogue. We can encourage them to get better, which sort of ignored everything else that was happening because it was fundamentally a fear about the fracturing of the Russian state. So we tolerated a lot of what Vladimir Putin did. We forget this now because we were genuinely afraid the Russian state would fall apart. And we just allowed, the Germans particularly sort of ignored a lot of what was going on because of their relief that it hadn't. And so then the pendulum is now massively swung in another direction because we missed all the signals of aggression and militarism and authoritarianism, or we're not willing to see those signals, and the extent to which he was increasingly intervening and meddling in the EU's affairs and American affairs later on and so on. And what they were doing to Ukraine and Georgia and the Baltic states and Finland to a lesser extent. So we're not willing to. So now we acknowledge this, and we acknowledge the genuine and existential risks of Russian military aggression expansionism, right? But the problem is that good, we're focusing on this. We're building up the capabilities. We're trying to save Ukraine because of many of our own mistakes we made in the last 20, 30 years. That is very good, and we need to develop the systems to deter and contain the Russians. However, we still need to keep in mind that the Putin regime is brittle. I mean, in putting it under pressure, we're also weakening its ability to cope with crisis, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to weaken them. We're trying to push them to a pain threshold where they stop. And that's the right thing to do. But if we push them to that pain threshold, we also weaken that system and need to have a contingency plan, a plan B, for if all those weaknesses within the Russian state system, Russian society reemerge and bring Russia back into a kind of crisis of collapse. And I think, again, this is about the EU in particular, and the onus is heavily on the EU, to develop a package of incentives to say to Russia, look, we have certain conditions and you have to stick to these conditions. If you stick to these conditions, you can get all this access and all this funding and all this engagement and all this good stuff. That doesn't mean that the Russian elite will necessarily take that, but simply putting that offer on the table enables the EU to say, look, we're not anti-Russian. We just have a set of basic rules about how the system works around here. But and we're open to you if you change. And also, we don't believe Vladimir Putin. We don't believe that you're trapped by history. We think you can change, right? And not because, and here we know that that change will only happen from inside. But if you do, here we'll help. We're willing to help you and encourage it. That will frustrate Ukrainians because they'll think, why are we rewarding the Russians? It wouldn't be a reward because it would have to be coupled with huge support for Ukraine. Right? But thinking this through, because I don't think it is in the EU or US or Japan or Canada or UK's interest for Russia to fall apart. I think that would be a complete disaster with implications for security implications that would cause us as much time and trouble and sap our resources as much as an aggressive Russia.
So one of our fellows actually said something recently along these lines. He said that basically we have to maintain ties with Russia aimed at bolstering diplomatic and political engagement and provide an example of what a Western democracy can be within Russia. And he also argued that Russia's efforts to reinvent itself as a democracy after the Cold War were unsuccessful in part due to the West's failure to put any serious effort into supporting Russian transformation. You would agree with that a little bit? I
would agree with that, but I would think that, I think that I'm sort of both a hawk and a dove on that. I'm dovish in that I think that Russia won't disappear or whatever, and even if Russia falls apart, you have to deal with, like, I don't know, a greater Eurasia. It's always going to be there for Europeans in particular. America can walk away, Canada can walk away, the Europeans can't walk away. Even the British can't walk away, right? And the Japanese also on the other side can't walk away. So we're stuck. And we're going to have a relationship with this entity. So we have to develop a clearer strategic understanding of where we want Russia to go. What would be, let's be honest, I mean, they accuse us of meddling anyway, so screw it. Let's just say, look, this is where we would prefer Russia to go, of how we would like to structure that relationship to encourage and incentivize that development, right? That's where I say yes. I mean, I'm not somebody who trades memes of Russia broken up into 20 parts and there's stupid maps online. It's ridiculous. I am hawkish in saying, that cannot be unconditional, right? The EU's basic survival is set on the acquis, on the four freedoms, and on the foundation set in the Treaty of Rome and the Treaty of Maastricht. That's also an internal tension in terms of rule of law and how the Eurozone is structured and all that. That's also an internal crisis. The EU is living through kind of Selden crisis of external and internal pressures, if you've ever read the Foundation novels by Asimov. The EU lives in a perpetual Selden crisis. But I think, more broadly speaking, that sort of means that the EU needs to be very clear this time and say, look, the Brits, they're pretty powerful, but we didn't make any exceptions. Sorry, right? And if you want this relationship, that's our rules. That's the rules. Them's the rules, and you need to observe them. And then let's see what's possible. But I don't buy into this notion that we go into Moscow and say, oh, you're exceptional and you're special and you're this great power and blah, blah. I think that's counterproductive because that stokes illusions in Moscow that when it gets practical and you then says, well, actually, no, we do have these rules, then the Russians just say, well, you lied to us, you betrayed us, you told us we were special, and then you're treating us like Serbia. No, we got to be honest with them about what the rules are. And if they want to stick to them, great.
How much did the overestimation of Russian state power hinder a firmer pre-war Western response? Do you think Ukraine's response says anything about the balance of global power vis-a-vis China or Taiwan?
I think that, I think one of my criticisms of, I was wrong before the war, right? So I was wrong. I thought that, and this is because my approach is Ukraine, and I'm also part Ukrainian. I was reading Ukrainian analysis, a lot of Ukrainian analysis, people who are really good, who know Russia very well. But they had this kind of Ukrainian understanding. They understood that Ukrainians would fight, and they understood the Ukrainian state was actually pretty robust, and they understood the resources. So they all thought the idea of Russia trying to take Kiev was nuts, right? And it was nuts, but the Russians did it anyway. right? So that was where I think, if I look back, I criticize it, is the extent to which I didn't really clock, how I was looking at Ukrainian reality, but the extent to which the Russian elite was operating in a different plane, ideological plane. And that's something, I discuss with my Russia Watcher friends and we engage with. But on the other hand, yes, I do think that as there is a certain kind of tendency among Western as well as Russia watchers or experts to make assumptions about Russian imperial exceptionalism and great power capabilities, that I think it's almost like an emotional investment in it. Like this idea that, because Russia is special and it's great power and it's this huge, like, surging power, that means that, we Russia watchers have a particular weight in global debate, which I think meant that they tended to assume that the Russian military was as good as the Russian military said it was. Now, there were a lot of military analysts, often Eastern European ones, interesting again, or Ukrainian analysts who, and that's where it's also worth listening to people with direct experience of Russia and the Russian space and the regional level, who are saying, well, no, actually, there's these corrupt dysfunctions, there's a broken doctrine, a lot of, the guy running the logistics system, General Bulgakov, well, he's involved in all kinds of interesting schemes and embezzlement. If that guy at the top is doing that, how robust is the system? I think what was lost was there was intense engagement among Russia watchers with the Russian military theory and theoretical debate, and not enough with the human factor, right? Because each institution, the Canadian military, the German military, EU Commission, each institution has its dysfunctions. But the more aware an institution is of its own dysfunctions, the more it can work to balance them. And there was an extent to which both the Russian military drank its own Kool-Aid, believed its own bullshit. And in the process, a lot of Russian analysts then also believed the Russian military is bullshit. And I think that then hampered our willingness to say, actually, this isn't an achievable goal, because the debate before 24 February was, this is going to be an onslaught. All the Ukrainians can do is an insurgency. Ukraine will not survive. This is not a manageable problem. And actually, looking back, we could have been more robust earlier and faster, because it is a manageable problem. It's a difficult challenge and an existential challenge, but it's one that we have the capacity to rise to. And there is something a bit paralyzing if we go to China and Taiwan in the same case, where I can see many of the same dynamics with analysis of Chinese military power. The steamroller analogy, for God's sake, no country is a steamroller. Every country has logistical and economic and social limitations on its capabilities. People should read more Alfred Wachs on that, and less Clausewitz and Jomini, right? And I think on a wider basis, Taiwan is like a highly developed, technologically developed island. It's an island 100 miles from the Chinese coast. D-Day was 15 to 20 miles from the French coast, with a much more equal, really? Is this amphibious landing? Like, do you think the Chinese can't do the naval math? Maybe, but that's nuts. And then we'd have to obviously we have to plan for that risk. But certainly it should put into perspective how much a state Taiwan, never mind Vietnam that has all these difficulties with China, the South China Sea, never mind that Vietnam would probably punch them into a pulp if pushed. We need to rethink a little bit about the balance of power between big states and small states, and whether small states can, as organized states, actually punch above their weight. I think there's two things I always think of when it comes to Canada. Is the Canadians tend to underestimate their influence. The Canadians are taken seriously in Europe, and sometimes that is something that several governments in Canada, I think the Trudeau government kind of overdoes it a little bit. I think there's ways of doing this. But certainly the Canadians, since Mackenzie King, and then of course you had Pearson and Trudeau, and even Mulroney, and then Chrétien. Every Canadian Prime Minister has been listened to in Europe. So there was a debate in Europe about strategic autonomy. It was just going back to this point that I made, that actually European strategic autonomy is an American interest. They have to devote less resources to protecting Europe. European strategic autonomy is also a British interest, because it is part of Europe, even though it kind of has this kind of dysfunctional relationship, but it's also in Canada's interest. European strategic autonomy, the ability of the Europeans to carry their own load in security terms, is a fundamental strategic interest to the Canadians. And if the Americans are always treated with a bit of suspicion, but the Canadians, first of all, they are geopolitically bilingual, in the sense that they operate quite well in the French as well as the English-speaking context. And there's this huge barrier between French strategic thinking in Europe and British and American strategic thinking on Europe, and that Canadians can bridge that, genuinely bridge that. And the Canadians are trusted in Europe and could really play a more active role in encouraging the Europeans to help themselves, because in doing so, they also help Canada.